Hello and welcome, fellow historians. My name is Rory McCabe. I will be presenting this video to you today, and today we'll be talking about the Tiananmen Square protests, or otherwise known as the Tiananmen Square massacre, that took place in 1989, and along with that, we will discuss constitutional rights and the fight for democracy. So let's begin. Here's a quote from an anonymous protester that participated in the 1989 Tiananmen Square protest. It states, "We are not here to incite violence. We are here to demand the rights promised to us in the Constitution." This quote here is influential in understanding why the Tiananmen Square protest took place and what the people that were participating in this protest were truly after. As it states, we are here to demand the rights promised to us in our Constitution. In Article 35 of the Constitution of the Chinese Communist Party states that they have a certain set of rights and they are exercising these rights. Whereas in reality, most of these rights that are in their constitution is more of a formality rather than actually practiced in China, because the state's interests supersedes that of the civilian or the individual, which is unfortunate, but we will go further into depth as the video continues. So let's get started. On June the 4th, 1989, I'm going to give you the world watched as tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square, crushing one of the most significant pro-democracy movements in modern-day China. What had began as a peaceful call for reform ended in a violent crackdown that left an untold number of civilians dead. The question is, why did this happen? What does this tell us about constitutional rights in China? And that we will go further in depth into. In this video, we will explore the causes of the protests leading up to it, the constitutional arguments surrounding freedom of assembly, the government's response to the protest, and the lasting impact of Tiananmen Square. So first things first, let's get started with the background and causes of Tiananmen Square. Here's a bronze sculpture of Hu Yanbing. Hu Yanbing was a very notable figure in China, especially because he was part of the PRC and he was the leader of the PRC. So he was the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. Therefore, in essence, he was the leader of China, because the Chinese Communist Party rules over the Chinese citizens and controls the government and the military. By the late 1980s, China was undergoing massive economic changes under Deng Xiaoping's leadership. While economic reforms improved growth, they also led to widespread corruption throughout the nation and inequality. Many young people during this time, especially students, felt disillusioned by the actions of their government, and inspired by democratic movements that were taking place in Eastern Europe, they called for political reform in their country. Following the death of Hu Yanbing, the former Communist Party leader, known for his liberal policies, became a spark of mass protests throughout the nation. Tens of thousands gathered in Tiananmen Square to mourn him and demand greater political reforms and an end to corruption and democratic reforms. Moving on to constitutional arguments on protest rights. So I could not find any good images of the people protesting with their banners. This is more of a modern image, but that being said, at the heart of Tiananmen Square's movement was the question of constitutional rights. The 1982 Constitution of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, specifically Article 35, guarantees that Chinese citizens have the right to freedom of speech, press, assembly, and demonstration. The protesters believed that by exercising their rights, they would be free from arrest or incarceration. However, the Chinese Communist Party saw things very differently. The government declared that the movement, although it was a peaceful protest, was a counter-revolutionary riot, quote unquote, and claiming that national security and stability of the nation outweighed the protesters' personal constitutional rights, and that are labeled under Article 35. The clash between legal guarantees and the state control would define the outcome of these protests. So let's move on to government response and crackdown. So what did the Chinese Communist Party, or the PRC, do in response to this? As the protesters continued to grow, the Chinese government grew uneasy. And on May 20th, 1989, martial law was declared in Beijing. The situation had reached a breaking point, and on the night of June 3rd into the morning of June 4th, when the People's Liberation Army moved in with tanks and live ammunition, eyewitnesses that were in the protest or surrounded by the protest recall scenes of chaos where troops fired into the crowds. Students tried to flee, but many were trapped. The Chinese government never released an official death toll, but estimates range from hundreds to thousands of people were either dead or injured. The world was horrified. Despite international autocracy, the Chinese government defined its actions, claiming that suppressing the protests were necessary to maintain national stability and prevent chaos in the nation. Moving on to the impact and legacy of this event. The Tiananmen Square massacre had lasting consequences. Domestically, it solidified the Communist Party of China's grip on power, making it clear that political dissent would no longer be tolerated. Internationally, China faced diplomatic fallouts with countries such as the US and Western world nations that are included in the EU and Canada. These nations imposed sanctions, and China became more isolated now than ever. Today, the Chinese government heavily censors discussion of the Tiananmen Square massacre, or as they call it, protest. Any mention of the protests is erased from the internet. Even images of the famous tank man, which I showed earlier in an earlier slide, who stood alone against a line of tanks, are banned throughout China and censored. You are not allowed to see it. The talk of it will get you in trouble. Yet in the memory of Tiananmen persists. Every year, Hong Kong held a candlelight ceremony or street walk to honor the victims until Beijing's crackdown on Hong Kong's democracy made even that impossible. So, in conclusion, the Tiananmen Square protests were not just about one moment in history. They were about a fundamental struggle for democracy, the limits of constitutional rights in authoritarian states, and the price of political dissent. While China continues to suppress this dark piece of history in its past, the fight for freedom and justice remains relevant, not just for China, but for the world around them. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you again next time.